So I'd like to welcome you back to our Joseph study. We're getting into our fifth part today. We're going to deviate just slightly today from the basics of the story to kind of give us an overview or some background in what Joseph was probably encountering when he came into Egypt. And so I'd like to just touch a little bit, just very lightly, on some archaeology in the story of Joseph, kind of looking at what Joseph may have found when he came into Egypt, what he may have seen. And so the journey to Egypt, what does the middle kingdom of Egypt look like at the time of Joseph's arrival? And so we have a bunch of little pieces here, carvings, artifacts, jewelry, etc. Pictures here up on the slide that kind of give us some input into what was happening in Egypt. All of these pieces here are from the Middle Kingdom, and you can look and see the intricate detail on many of these. The brooch that goes on a necklace, you can see it's made out of gold, has some very fine details in the whole thing. Even with the small colored stones that are placed inside the gold, very detailed, very important. And so we can see just by the basics of this that there was a very high level of art inside of Egypt during the time when Joseph arrived. In order for this high level of art to exist, there was likely also a very high level of mathematics and other knowledges at this time. And so we're going to start out here just basically going over, this is just out of Wikipedia, the list of pharaohs. The list of pharaohs that they have from the 11th, the end of the 11th, coming into the 12th dynasties. We have the first ones on the list here are the ones coming out of the 11th dynasty. And then the beginning at the bottom of this image, you'll see the first ones that are in what's called Lower Nubia. This is the southern part of Egypt getting into what would be really the northern part of its connection into the African states. And so these were leaders that were inside of this lower part of Egypt, which for a time actually was split from Egypt. Um, we get into the second set of kings, and we're getting now into the relative period when likely Joseph came in. The last king on here, you have Senusret the second, very likely from the period of when Joseph was coming into Egypt, approximately speaking. We get into Senusret the third, and you can see that between Senusret the second, if you have a good look at his face, and Senusret the third, and then Amenemhat the third, you can see that most of these statues have very serious expressions, which is very interesting. It's often considered that these likely were given serious expressions because of the difficult times in which they governed. And of course, from the story of Joseph, we know very well when Joseph got there and was placed into prison, as we'll get into the rest of this story later on. We know that Joseph was called out to interpret a dream from one of the pharaohs that talked about 7 years of drought. And so there was a difficult time in here in this period. Um, so one of these was likely in power when Joseph showed up. One of these is likely in power, or all of these may likely have been in power during Joseph's period of time. Now, another piece I'd just like to touch on briefly is some of the artifacts that give us reason to believe that for sure Israel was in Egypt and the Exodus did happen, and most likely around the 12th dynasty period. These are just some of the things that, the reality is the quantity of artifacts that we have is really very small. And we have to always remember that when we're talking about comparing artifacts, archaeology with the scriptures themselves, whether it be the Bible or the Book of Mormon story. The number of artifacts we have is really, really minute to be able to make sometimes these connections. But as you're going through all the artifacts, every once in a while, things pop up that kind of seem really important to the overall story. And so I'm just going to go through just a brief few artifacts that have been found in Egypt that can maybe lead us to believe more that the Bible is very accurate. And so the first one here we have is the Merneptah Stela, discovered in 1896 by a pioneering Egyptologist, Flinders Pettiere, and Merneptah Stela has long been famous, has been the most famous artifact related to biblical history in the era of the Exodus. Conventionally, it was dated to around 1208 BC. It was erected in the 5th year of Pharaoh Merneptah, who was the son of Ramses II. The monument pronounces military victories over a series of enemies, including the people of Israel, living to the north of Egypt, establishing the fact that Israel is already an established power in the land. So on this stela, you have this very small excerpt, which is the picture on the right-hand side of the slide. And you can see the part that is kind of brought out in kind of a goldish color there so that we can see it better. This is stating that Egypt had some victory over one of its enemies, which was the house of Israel, which lived up to the north. And of course, that's important because it establishes that Israel existed up to the north. And this was done just a little after the time of Ramses II. And so if this is accurate as a 1208 BC stela, if that dating is roughly accurate, that means Israel has already went through the Exodus, already traveled through the desert, already did all of its conquests getting up to the Promised Land, and is now to some degree established in the Promised Land. That's important because it gives us a basis for when Israel could not have been in Egypt or been doing the Exodus. It had to be before Ramses II, roughly speaking. Another one, the Middle Sal house at Avaris. At least 650 years before the Merneptah stela was erected, a Syrian-style house was built in the Egyptian's Nile Delta at the site of Avaris. Its remains were unearthed by a team of Austrian excavators led by Manfred Beitek, who recognized it as a Mittel Saal house, or middle room house. It was part of a Semitic community that settled on virgin grassland near one of the branches of the Nile River. By examining the cultural materials left behind, the excavators concluded that the people had come from the Canaanite area, or the Canaan area, and settled with the permission of the Egyptian state. And so in this Avaris area, which is kind of a really fertile area, a place where you would naturally want to take and raise animals and also crops and whatnot, they've got this house. Actually, there's more than one out there now that they've uncovered. And these are houses that have a build style very distinct from Egyptian styles. And from all they know till today, the style of this house really is not an Egyptian style. It's really more of a Canaanite, from the area of Canaan style, built out in the Syria type area. And so that kind of gives us an idea that perhaps even before that stela, which was just after Ramses II, 650 years preceding that, we're talking about 1800 BC, roughly speaking, here we have this house that looks like it could potentially be pointing to the fact that the house of Israel, which they came from that area of Canaan, lived in the Egyptian area. And let's continue. The Joseph Canal, or the Bar Yusuf. In the same Middle Kingdom period as the Mittel Sal house, a canal was developed that ran parallel to the central portion of the Nile River for about 100 miles before dumping into a large lake called the Fayum. We don't have any record of what its name was at the time, but the Arabic name for it that goes back over 1,000 years is the Bar Yusuf, or the Waterway Canal of Joseph. And so there's this canal over in Egypt that exists today, runs about 100 miles, and has always been known as Joseph's Canal. Was it one that Joseph built during his time period? Hard to say, but there's reason to believe that it's carried that name for a reason. And so it's just another one of those little things. It's not definitive proof by any way, but it's something that helps bring our narrative of the Joseph story together. Another piece, what's called the Brooklyn Papyrus. One of the most common charges against the Bible's Exodus account is there is no evidence of massive Semitic slave population in Egypt in the era of Pharaoh Ramses. However, in the earlier Middle Kingdom, 13th dynasty, there is evidence of Semitic settlements all across the northeast Nile Delta. A document from further south at this time lists nearly 100 slaves from a single estate, the majority of whom were Semitic. And so, if we think about Joseph coming in around the 12th dynasty, and of course we know that he came into power, became the vizier under the Pharaoh, number 2 position, brought in his family. His family were well received. They were given lands. They began to grow and prosper. In the beginning, they weren't slaves. In the beginning, they were free people, and they grew for quite a while until Joseph died. And sometime after he died, a Pharaoh rose up who didn't remember Joseph. And he begins to be concerned because these Semitic people that are living in his land are suddenly getting to the point where they may be more powerful than the Egyptians. And he's worried about them taking over. And so they begin to enslave the Israelites. And so, as this papyrus indicates, you would expect after some time, depending on when Joseph showed up, sometime in there, you would have this period when all of a sudden slaves would be everywhere. And that's exactly what this Brooklyn Papyrus is stating, that during the 13th dynasty is when they're guesstimating this papyrus comes from. There were many slaves, and many even in this one single estate, which gives indication that likely throughout Egypt there were actually a lot of Semitic or Israelite slaves. Another one. This is a statue that is over in Egypt, and it's got these rings on it. And these rings the Egyptian used to give pieces of information. This is called the Shasu of Yahweh name ring. And so what you're seeing here is this oval on the column with some pictorial graphs inside the oval. That's called the name ring. And so the Exodus account indicates that the Pharaoh had never heard of Israel's God, Yahweh. Yet the ancient temple of Soleb in modern Sudan, an inscription from Pharaoh Amenhotep III, now we're talking, into the period when probably Israel would have been slaves in Egypt, more than 100 years before Ramses II, lists enemies of Egypt. One of those enemies is Shasu, the nomads of Yahweh. This is the oldest known inscription to use the name Yahweh, showing that after the Exodus, Israel's God was no longer unknown to the pharaohs. And so on this statue, one of Egypt's listed enemies are the nomads of Yahweh. And that's just interesting. They recognized both of those pieces of information. Let's continue. Again, you can see on this piece of a stone inscription, you can see some name rings again. And this is called the Berlin pedestal stone inscription. And you can see that there are actually 3 name rings here on this piece of the pedestal, with the third one being kind of broken off. And it's the third one that's semi-broken off that's actually important because they've kind of rebuilt it, reconstructed it between several archaeologists and have an idea of what it really is. And so the Marinepta stela no longer contains the oldest known mention of Israel. In an ancient inscription, the Berlin pedestal includes a set of name rings, each associated with a description of a bound prisoner, of enemies in the Canaan area, with damage to the right hand ring in the image. A reconstruction of the name ring by German Egyptologist Manfred George, Peter van der Veen, and Christopher Theiss has shown that it names Israel. The date of the artifact is disputed, but most put it somewhere around a century prior to Ramses. Again, showing, a century before Ramses that Israel was already listed among Egypt's enemies. And that's important because, again, it's establishing that the Exodus and the time of Joseph was prior to Ramses. This is another one, and this is actually a really interesting one that we may or may not get into more in depth later on. We'll see how the study goes. But the Impur papyrus. This is a document that was found, again, from this period of time. It's a papyrus housed in the Leiden Museum in the Netherlands, and it records a time of great calamities in Egypt and the resulting chaos that occurred when society had broken down, known as the admonitions of an Egyptian sage, and also as the Epur papyrus. It uses several phrases early on that bear an uncanny similarity to the Exodus account. These include the river turning to blood, a time of darkness, all is ruin, wailing throughout the land with no shortage of dead people, and the slave taking what he finds, while gold, silver, and precious stones are strung on the necks of female slaves. And of course, we know when the Exodus was about to happen, God commanded his people to go to their captives, the Egyptians, and ask for treasures, their wealth, whatever. And the Egyptians bestowed all kinds of gifts of gold, silver, and whatnot to the Israelites just before they left. And so that kind of ties in with this manuscript. And so that's pretty interesting and pretty important. And of course, we have the walls of Jericho, and this has been a disputed one for actually quite a long time because in the beginning, they felt like when they discovered the walls of Jericho, it was the nail in the coffin to the biblical account because they found that Jericho was toppled long before Ramses. And this is important because, of course, the story that for a long time has been shown was that it was the Ramses period when Israel had their exodus. And, of course, the movies, they show Ramses and Moses during that period of time. But actually, all of the evidence that they've been finding now is putting Israel in Egypt before the Ramses period. And, of course, when we move back, when they were in Egypt and when the Exodus happened, all of a sudden all the parts fall together, fall in line. And the walls of Jericho are no longer the last nail in the coffin, so to speak, but actually another evidence to the reality of the biblical story. And so the starkest example of the Exodus story are the walls of Jericho. The Bible tells us the walls came tumbling down as the Israelites marched around the city, blowing their trumpets and shouting. Then they burned the city. And archaeologists have found that the high walls of the city did fall outward and down the slope that the city was built on. And this would have provided a convenient ramp for the Israelites to travel up to take the city. A very quick burn layer that took place after the walls came down and evidenced extremely high temperatures convinced the excavators of the city that it was intentionally burned by an enemy. And so the walls fell down, creating a nice rampart for people to climb up, and then there's evidence that the city was burnt. Again, confirming the biblical account as we have it, because they were in their exodus, heading towards the promised land when they came to Jericho. Now, we look at all those pieces of archaeology, and they're wonderful and they're important. But I kind of want to tie a few of these pieces into the Joseph story itself. And so another important or interesting piece of history. And so you see these wonderful vases or maybe candle holders or whatever they may have been used for in that time. And these are made out of diorite. Diorite is a hard rock. It's usually rated between 6.5 and 7 on the Mohs scale for hardness. And that's important. The Mohs scale for hardness is giving us a very simple way of looking at the hardness of different materials and what's required to work with them. And so, for instance, if something has a 5 on the Mohs scale, whatever this material is, whether it's a metal or a mineral or whatever, then it's going to require something higher than that. In other words, if this was a 5, it's going to require something 6 and up to be able to work it as a material. And so, as an example, to compare, copper is a 2.5 to a 3. And so then we ask ourselves a question. Could you work diorite with copper? You couldn't. Copper is much softer. Hitting on diorite, because it's so hard, would just damage your copper. You'd never be able to use a copper tool on diorite. And so emeralds, on the other hand, are 7.5 to 8. That's important. That's actually harder than diorite and would be a substance that you could use on diorite, although not a great choice because it's just barely stronger. But then you have quartz. Quartz is another option, which is a 9. And inside of sand, oftentimes there's a lot of quartz pieces. And so quartz being a 9 is strong enough that you could use it to work on diorite. And of course, diamonds are a 10 on the Mohs scale. Comparatively, a steel file is usually about 6.5 on the Mohs scale. So could you use a steel file to work on diorite? No, it's not strong enough. It's actually weaker or about the same strength as diorite. And so you need a stronger material. A typical file wouldn't scratch it. Why is that important? Well, there's a couple reasons here. When you're looking at these objects, you're looking at very high quality objects. These vases, these urns, whatever they may have been, are delicately done. Some of them are very small. You're not pounding on these with a hammer and a chisel. That's important to remember. And so considering today, today when we're working in very difficult materials, just an example, in my house, we're putting in some cement columns in the wall. We're using diamond-tipped saw blades to cut the cement. That's important because diamond is very strong. And so whatever they were using on these vases had to be very strong. And they had to be able to work with that material delicately enough. This isn't just a matter of banging on rocks. You've got to work delicately enough to get the smooth sides. If you take a hammer and a chisel, just as an example, and you begin pounding on a rock that's softer than the chisel, of course you'll break it, you'll flake it. And if you know what you're doing, you can actually shape a rock. There's a lot of statues, rocks that have been marble statues that have been pounded on by hammers and chisels and left really good. But typically speaking, when you use a hammer and a chisel, you're going to be leaving what you would call fingerprints or tool marks in the objects. And that's important because as you're looking at these fine details, you want to look for the tool mark. The tool marks tell you just how educated and advanced the society is. Now, in some of these objects, these vases that are coming now out of Egypt, and there's one of the pyramids over there that they found over 40,000 of these vases over in Egypt. Let's go on to the second picture here. You can see some more of these. Very detailed, very fine. Again, 40,000 of these under a pyramid. These were detailed with special tools. What does this all mean to us? Well, this means that the Egypt that Joseph's walking into is actually a very intelligent country. They have a high level of art, likely high level of mathematics. In these images you can see right here, most of these are diorite. The upper right corner one that looks like a small glass is actually made out of quartz. And again, quartz was 9 on the scale. So what are you going to use to shape quartz? You're not going to use quartz to shape quartz. You're not going to use sand to shape quartz, because sand, which has quartz in it, may be used to shape the diorite, but it's not going to shape quartz. You've got to have something stronger. And if you look at the wall of that little cup, or whatever it was, it's a very thin wall. You're not going to be pounding on this with a hammer and a chisel. And so this speaks to the high level of education and understanding that the Egyptians had. Now, let's touch a little bit more on the math. We have only a limited number of problems from Egypt that concern geometry. And so when we're looking at archaeology, like I said, there's not a lot of archaeology out there to really bring things together, but we do have a few pieces that give us a little bit of a view into math, even in this middle period. Geometric problems appear in both the Moscow Mathematical Papyrus, the MMP, and the Rhind Mathematical Papyrus, the RMP. The examples demonstrate that the ancient Egyptians knew how to compute areas of several geometric shapes and the volumes of cylinders and pyramids. They have area, triangles. The scribes record problems computing the area of a triangle. Rectangles, problems recording the area of a rectangular plot of land, appear in the RMP and the MMP. A similar problem appears in the Luhan Mathematical Papyri in London. Circles, problem 48 of the RMP compares the area of a circle approximated by an octagon and its circumscribing square. This problem's result is used in problem 50, when the scribe finds that the area of a round field of a diameter of 9 khet. And then hemisphere. Problem 10 on the MMP finds the area of a hemisphere. And so this here is an image of the Moscow Mathematical Papyrus, and down below you have then copied out what it was that was actually on there, the text. And these papyruses are actually like math journals, math documents that are teaching and showing how to find out this information. Again, on here there is volumes, the cylindrical granaries. Several problems compute the volume of cylindrical granaries on the RMP, while problem 60 on the RMP seems to concern a pillar or a cone instead of a pyramid. It's rather small and steep with a sect reciprocal of a slope and 4 palms per cubit. In section 4.3 of the Lahan Mathematical Papyri, the volume of a granary with a circular base is found, is using the same procedure as the RMP 43. And then rectangular granaries, several problems in the Moscow Mathematical Papyri, for instance, problem 14, and in the Rhind Mathematical Papyris, problems numbers 44, 45, and 46, compute the volume of rectangular granaries and truncated pyramids, frustums. The volume of truncated pyramids is computed in the MMP 14. So, we have this high level of art. We have this high level of mathematics. What does that all mean to us in our Joseph story? Well, we have to ask the question, who was Joseph? And of course, Genesis 37:2, go back to that verse. It says, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Okay, so we know that in this chapter 37, which we've already read, around Joseph's 17th year of age is when his brothers take him and sell him. We don't know precisely. It doesn't tell us in the story. But from this point forward is when our story begins to tell and to open up. So a little after 17, maybe as late as his 18th birthday. We don't really know for sure. There's a lot of guesses in it. But anyway, it's after his 17th birthday. Now we jump ahead in our story to Genesis 41:46. Joseph is standing before the Pharaoh. He's interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams. And it says, And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out of the presence of the Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. Important. So, when he's interpreting the dream, he's 30 years old. We take off 17, and we have this 13-year period approximately when Joseph worked for Potiphar, and also when Joseph was imprisoned. And we don't know how much time was in each of them. There's a lot of writings on this. A lot of them think that he may have been in prison for the bulk of this time and actually working for Potiphar the minor part of this time. But you've got a 13-year period in here. Joseph shows up in Egypt a little after 17 years old. Why is that important? Again, we go back to our story. Okay? Verse 1, Genesis 39. Let's pick up the story again and just think about what we're seeing here. And Joseph, who is now sometime after his 17th birthday, before his 30th birthday, he's brought down to Egypt. And Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh's captain of the guard in Egypt, bought him of the hand of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. So, this is the captain of the guard. This is the guy right under Pharaoh somewheres. He's to protect the Pharaoh, the palace, etc. This isn't your average Joe buying a slave. This is a prestigious person, likely with a lot of wealth, likely with a lot of possessions, buying up a slave. Why is that important? Well, verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And he was in the house of his master in Egypt. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and served him, and made him overseer of his house, and all that he had put into his hand. And it came to pass, from the time that he had made him overseer of his house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in his house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand. And he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. And so you have this prestigious person in the Egyptian government. He buys a slave. This slave is likely 17 to 20 years old, more or less. Would your average 17 to 20-year-old today, another way to put it, would Bill Gates hire your average 17 to 20-year-old and put him in charge of everything he has? Because that's basically what this story is telling us. You have this nation which has a high level of math, a high level of arts, and other things, very good at building and constructing pyramids with high accuracy, high levels of accuracy. And with all of this knowledge, this young kid who's being brought in as a slave is suddenly put in charge of all of Potiphar's possessions in his house, put in charge of his business dealings, put in charge of buying and selling. If Potiphar had land, he would have probably been put in charge of selling whatever was produced, working with the workers. There's a high level of management here that Joseph is suddenly being put in charge of. And that, I think, ought to give us a moment of reflect on who Joseph was. When they're working in high-level geometry and art in Egypt already, they're already working with some pretty high-quality stuff that even today we could duplicate most of it, but we have some pretty high-tech machinery to be able to duplicate it with. We've got high-tech milling machines with diamond-tipped stone burrs for milling these hard rocks. Very expensive machines. Okay, how did the Egyptians do them? We don't really know. We don't ever find in archaeology high-quality machines like we have today, and so we're left to surmise and guess. But however they did it, Joseph's coming into this and immediately being elevated in a very important position. And I think that's important in our overall story as we contemplate who and what Joseph is. He was not just your average Joe off the street, so to speak. He was well educated himself. He came in and he fit right into the society and was immediately able to work in a management position. That I think is really important when we're looking at Joseph and his story overall. God was with him, uh, absolutely. But God doesn't just fill in for us in our ignorance. I don't believe for a minute that Joseph walked in here without knowing math, arts, whatever. I believe that probably he was on par with whatever the Egyptians knew when he came in here, even as a young person. And I think that's important in our story because I think that probably the Middle Kingdom, when Joseph comes in, is a very, very intelligent period of time. And we may get more into that as we go on in our story. But this is basically the end of part 5. I just wanted to touch on some of the archaeology that probably Joseph would have been coming into, what things kind of looked like, and what we can kind of guess Joseph looked like as a person, as a young man. Likely very studious, likely very studied, likely very knowledgeable. At a very young age, able to take a management position and do well and prosper Potiphar's holdings. That's pretty important because, of course, we know Joseph is right after this put into prison, and we'll touch on the rest of the story coming up in the next part. Hope to see you back soon. God bless.